Been able to download and add to Dropbox. So Chris is recording to his computer today. Yeah, and that is it. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to hand over to Christo now.
Thanks, Liesl. Thanks, Liesl, and welcome everyone, and welcome Allon. I basically met you on Twitter. Seems like this is how we meet interesting people these days, is sometimes on Twitter. Been following some of the people who seem to have great admiration for you, and then I started following you, and then at the beginning of the lockdown you posted a very interesting article, and the link is there in the chat. It's the last one: organization development after the flood, what is to be done? And then I don't know how long ago, when I asked you to come on the talk, you posted the statement that I think you said most mergers are actually acquisitions.
All mergers are acquisitions.
All mergers are acquisitions. And it rang so true for me, because we've just been through one ourselves where it was a merger, but actually it was an acquisition, and we were lucky enough, I think, to extract ourselves from that and to effect an unbundling. Because it really was, it was, the experience of that was an experience of cultural takeover and, shall I call it, identicide, complete killing of the identity of the one company by the end, and we refused to be killed off in terms of identity. So, but that was an interesting experience and an interesting battle. So I was very curious to hear what you have to say about that, and I know that you've got long international experience in mergers and acquisitions. So that was initially when I invited you. That was the thought: is let's talk about mergers and acquisitions, and I think it is an interesting conversation. But there's so many other things that we can also talk about today. You made a point, and there's an interesting article. The very first link that I posted there is a whole long argument about Western values, I think, amongst other things, the imposition of Western values and the preponderance of Western values in organization development, and how it actually prevents organization development from being effective in, well, global and non-Western contexts. And then you said a very interesting thing a few days ago, and maybe we can go there as well. You said OD has absolutely nothing to bring to the table to combat racism.
Zero.
And I'd like to go there. In fact, you not only
Zero.
You said only OD can not only nothing to offer, it actually causes harm in many instances. It damages our ability to deal with that. So those are all very interesting provocations. But before we get there, Allon, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your long journey in organization development. You've been in the field for decades. You actually retired at this point.
Okay, so first of all, what a pleasure to see all these faces. Even some of them are microphones. I also want to say that from time to time I may put on my glasses and take them off because I'm just after 2 cataracts and I don't know yet exactly how to use my eyes. So sometimes I'll put them on and sometimes I'll take them off. I'm 71 years old. I've been an OD consultant since I was 23. I was in the armed services for many years as an OD consultant. I've worked in mergers and acquisitions. I owned a company which did OD in Australia, Southeast Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Canada. A little bit in the States, but in Canada. my family is from here. I happen to have been born in Montreal, which is where my perfect English comes from. But I've been back here now for 51 years. I've done work with Fortune 500 companies, family businesses. The only thing I do is OD. You know, I'm not a social worker and OD or a trainer and OD. All I've done is OD. And I tend to think probably differently than a lot of people do. Christo pointed out something. I want to make it even clearer. I think that OD, as it presently is positioned, is basically a new form of cultural imperialism. It is the imposition of Western values on a non-Western reality. And I think that I hope in the conversation I'll be able to point out how we can avoid becoming part of of cultural imperialism. In the how would you say in English? In the guise, G-U-I-S-E, in the guise of yeah, a lot of words are missing. You'll notice that as we go on. So, I did 12 mergers and acquisitions. Each one was about 5 to 6 years. Failure rate was, I had 2 failures. I had 10 successes, but of the 10 successes, the company's product basically disappeared within 2 years. So you can put that off. Something which, you know, we say in Hebrew, the operation was successful, but the patient died. Okay, so that's my background, and that's it.
So, Allon, from that, it sounds that you have a clear perspective on what is organization development and what is it not. What is your definition of organization development? What do you think it is, and where does it become these other things?
Okay, so first of all, I forgot one thing. I write a satiric column called Gloria Ramsbottom. You can find her on Twitter. She's the alter ego, and that's my hobby. That's how I keep sane. So I think that the question that you're asking me, what is OD? If that isn't fluid and changed and updated, we're in a big problem here. I don't think that it's a problem that we're always asking ourselves what OD is. I think that's common. It's common in a lot of professions. But I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we always going back to basics? Because what happened was that as a response to Nazism and as a response to World War II, and because of military funding, OD was developed by certain people at a certain time to address certain problems. Those problems have changed. Organizations have changed. The values are changed. The role of the human resource has changed. We see a change in 2008 by the collapse of the economy. We're seeing a total implosion now by the total devastation of the free market as we know it. Where we can talk about organizations becoming global, of remote work. So that question is very relevant. I'll tell you what it is. It isn't what it was started out as. That's for sure. Okay, it isn't as we started out as. And I want to just talk about one example. When you ask, I'll answer your question, but I tend to go like that, and then but I come back in the end. As long as I don't get distracted by Ingrid Hurwitz's cat who jumps across the table from time to time. So let's look at teamwork. Okay, teamwork is a big thing that all OD people work on. Okay, it's like apple pie or motherhood. It's, you know, find me an OD consultant who doesn't work on teamwork, and he's probably a chef or something. So I don't think that's true, because let's look at what teamwork is. Teamwork is basically, here's someone, I'm in finance, this guy is in marketing, he's in sales. We need to find a way to solve issues between ourselves without escalating everything to the top and drowning them in shit. That's basically what we do, okay, in teamwork, is not managing, not throwing everything upstairs to our boss, and we have to solve our issues with our peers. But that's very Western, because in many societies, the role first, teamwork is basically being loyal to your boss, because your boss gives you orders, okay, and he protects you. He protects you. And if you go and solve an issue with someone who is not subordinate to your boss, that's not teamwork, that's heresy. Now, you can see that in China, you can see it in Arab countries. I think you can see it in parts of you can see it in Spain. Surely you can see it in Spain, and you can see it in authoritarian cultures, in more tribal cultures. But we keep on with the same shit, that you know, solve the issues with your peers, be open with your peers, blah 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 blah. But those values, okay, those values aren't shared by everyone. I know that many people would say work with a peer outside who does not report to your boss is treason. Okay, now OD is the ability, I'm not getting back to your question now. First of all, OD is something which enables change, and it promotes change by removing barriers. OD is an art, not a science. All these models are crap. It's an art form. It promotes change. It enables change. It's system focused. It focuses on a system, and it is value neutral as much as possible. It is a value neutral, system focused removal of barriers for change. Okay, that's what OD is. And if we go back to basics, where it's like, I remembered that I like reading medical history, and there's two forms I've read about which have really shocked me. First was, how did they used to do a cataract? They used to put a hot coal on someone's cataract and try to just burn it enough. So the operation was great, but the person was blind and eventually died from that. And in a hernia, what they used to do is just cut out the part that is sticking out. Of course, the person died also. So they don't go back to basics, okay? Well, we're not going back to basics in law. We're trying to reform law. But in OD, we're always going back to basics. What the hell is that? That's ridiculous, going back to basics. Because the world has changed. The world of organizations has changed. Look at how we're talking now, okay? Who could have imagined this a while ago? And almost all of your practitioners, okay, all of your practitioners have been educated in Western terms, in Western values. The profession holds Western values. People are still talking about Kurt Lewin and Kurt this and Kurt that. And heavens, you look outside and organizations have changed. Of course, we're the experts in change, right? We tell everyone else how to change. That's very arrogant, because we haven't changed. We keep navel gazing and saying, what are we? I have no problem defining that. We are a value neutral, system focused, change enabler, barrier remover. Okay, and that's what we do. But if I don't see the basics as very relevant anymore.
Do you think it's almost well, not so much the emergence of new basics, but a whole different context in which we do this work and show up to do this work.
Absolutely. I think that everything has changed. Everything has changed, probably except us. And I think that our ability to be flexible is something we preach. It reminds me of, I don't know whether it's here, you've got, all over the world, you have people in preachers who are sex abusers, right? So they go in and they talk about, be holy and be this and be that, and then they go and they do all these horrendous crimes. We teach others to be flexible. It's the most rigid profession you can imagine. We don't ask ourselves, how do we have to change? I think one of the problems is in the very question. When you ask yourself the question, well, given what's going on in the world, how do we position ourselves? And the question is, do we know what's going on in the world as far as we're concerned? Okay? How do we have to change? Not how do others have to change. That's not the question.
That's interesting. Allon, one of the things you say in your blogs, I think I may misquote it, but that OD is about helping people to work together better. And that these persisting some of those persisting Western values are exactly in our way as we try to help people to work. But you mentioned the example of teamwork and how we misinterpret or misuse the notion of teamwork in contexts where perhaps the whole idea of the team is understood differently. What are some of these other organization development values, Western values, that you think are standing in our way, and in what way?
Okay, I just want to give a little example of the teamwork and how I dealt with it, because I don't want to say we need to change and then leave it as a, how do you say, a sisma, a slogan. I was in China 4 years ago. The manager was Israeli, the GM was Israeli, and there were two Chinese area managers. One was in Shanghai and one was in Guangzhou. And they were fighting all the time about who did what. The guy in Guangzhou said, well, I'm responsible for Guangzhou, but the headquarters is in your territory. And the guy in the other territory says, well, I'm responsible for my area, but the headquarters of your organization is here. And they were fighting all the time. And they were talking to their staff. And their staff were not cooperating, and they were sharing emails, and there were visits in the other person's territory when they didn't, where they didn't get along. And of course, the average OD person would say, well, we need dialogue, and we need transparency, and we need conflict resolution, which is all totally irrelevant in this situation. So we went, I invited all three people out to lunch. And I said I would pay for the lunch, okay? Which basically was, I told them the lunch was funded, and I said that the Israeli general manager had asked me to invite the people out to lunch, which means that you're not talking to me, you're talking to my boss. Okay, that was number one. Then I said, there's some horrible rumors which are totally false that Mr. Zhou and Mr. Yang aren't getting along. And I'd like us to discuss how we can end those rumors, because there's some evil tongues wagging. And I need to get back to the Israeli CEO, to the Loban, to the big boss, and we have to discuss. And it was a wonderful success. You know, the meal cost $300. I inferred that there was a problem, but it wasn't their problem. And they said, oh shit, it's transparent. Okay, we got to stop this. But that was the intervention. And that's what OD is now. It's not sitting down, putting people together, having be open and, how do you say in English, authentic. Because in China, they would lose face. They couldn't talk directly. They couldn't talk with me or with anyone afterwards. They would be so angry. But we're dealing with the, I made the intervention adapted, okay, to the cultural constraints. Now you're asking about other things besides teamwork, okay? Because that example is about teamwork. Let's talk about being authentic, okay? Authentic, expressing your feelings and bringing yourself to the table. That's very Western. That's very Western. I know that in a very dominant value in Thailand, it's called Kleng Jai. Kleng Jai is you must do everything to make sure that the people you're speaking with is comfortable. Everything. You do not make the other person need to confront you in any way whatsoever. So, for example, in a meeting, he says, are you meeting your quotas? You will say yes. Why? Because you don't want him to feel uncomfortable. After the meeting, you'll come to him and say, those numbers, I was just Kreng-jaiing you. This is the real picture. So being authentic at work, are you kidding? That's the second example. A third example is authenticity. A third example is, how do you say it, empowerment. Oh, we're big into the empowerment business, but do you know that in many, many cultures, outside of the land of the free and the home of the brave and a few places in the English-speaking world, empowerment basically means my boss is, pardon me, fucking me. That's what it means. He's giving me something to do, which he should be doing, and he's going to fuck me. Because if he weren't, he'd be protecting me. Sorry for my English, but I think in South Africa, you don't have this political correctness either. Certainly we don't. So are you kidding? And people come, empower, empower, empower. And most people say, I'm in trouble. He's empowering me. I'm being set up to fail.
Yeah.
That's another value. And let's go talk about transparency. Transparency in many, many places outside the US is stupidity. Let's take the Chinese expression, muddy the water and catch the fish. Let's start with that. Let's start with bargaining cultures, the Iranians, the Israelis, many Mediterranean countries where you bargain all the time. So what is this transparency all about? Transparency basically means setting yourself up to be screwed in many countries. So why are we promoting transparency if transparent people get screwed? No one understands that, but we're there. Transparency, teamwork, empowerment. Okay, now let's talk about some things which some people here may totally object to. I work in a, well, I don't go there anymore ever since the shutdown, but I'm working in Japan with a client where the product manager is a 26-year-old PhD from Boston, okay? And the decision makers in Japan are 55 to 70-year-old salarymen. And they're rejecting her input because of age and gender, okay? But American headquarters, which wants diversity, they want to basically shove diversity down the Japanese throat, okay? And my job is to make the communication between this 26-year-old PhD and the old salarymen work. Well, I've got good news for me. It ain't going to work, so I'm going to get paid for a long time. But it's not going to work. It will never work because the diversity, someone's radio is on, and I can hear something blasting in the background. So that's not going to, all of this politically correct and gender equality, I don't think it flies east of Western Europe. I don't, by the way, think in Western Europe it flies either. But there's another example where we're trying to impose values on someone else. But I can go on and on. I think that there's hardly a value that OD practices today which is universally applicable.
That's so interesting. It's almost as if there's a kind of a, well, that Western idealism always in some way translated in some kind of Western imperialism.
It's arrogance. It's cultural arrogance. And well, of course, what a lot of OD people say, it's diversity. Diversity means I'll listen to what you do, but then you'll do what I do. So we have diversity programs, we have diversity day, we have quotas, we have all this stuff. You know, we look at, okay, let's check everyone's skin color to see if we're diversity compliant. But that's not diversity. That's not but that's the Western way. The Western perception of diversity is let's be compliant. Let's be compliant. Let's just be good enough. So we focus on things like we'll say skin color or religion or things. But I think that there's lots and lots of diversity within people with the same skin color. If we go beyond, there's a lot of diversity between the way people in sales work and the way that people in engineering work. That's where there's a lot of diversity. But we want to be compliant and make sure we have the right number of Jews and Arabs and Africans and Spanish and whatever. So we're falling into these traps of, how do you say in English? When the pool isn't deep, of shallowness. We're actually, what I say, inhaling our own smoke.
I wonder if there's anyone on the call who is just thinking of organization development in South Africa and bringing Western values, and we also have this diversity, inclusion, etc., etc. It's been going through quite a long journey. I think I saw Sharon nodding her head and saying yes, where it is almost as if our attempts to address the problem is actually just a sort of more or less sophisticated attempt to plaster over it, to cover it, so that we can go on with our lives and live according to our own lofty and superior values. Are there African or other people in the call? Are there any examples for you of organization development that comes into conflict with what we are facing in South Africa?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Christo, and thanks, Allon, for the points that you've made so far. I got excited when Allon spoke about how shallow and how compliant driven our efforts as OD practitioners can be, and especially in the diversity space. And it drives me crazy, because it's exactly the way that Allon puts it. It's like, okay, you know what? I'll listen to you, and I'll even, it even becomes physical, facial expressions, and I will show that I understand and I'm compassionate and really, yes, I feel you, and oh, thank you for making me aware of this or that or whatever the dimension might be. And then when it's all done, at the back of my mind, I'm just complying. And then when it's all done and the compliance is done, and in South Africa, we tick the boxes and we say that we've done diversity training. For me, like, how do you have diversity training together? But anyway, so we've done diversity training, and then we tick the boxes, and we'll be sure to smile at one another when we walk down the passage, and all the things that the OD people said we should do, and we'll have this day and that day and this intervention and that whatever, etc. but all very shallow, because at the end of the day, I love what Allon said. I will listen, but at the end you will do as I say. So yes, we've done all of those things. We've had those conversations. We've even cried, you know, we've shed the tears, and we've hugged, and we've apologized, or whatever it is that happens in these diversity training sessions. And then you down the line, 3 months later, 6 months later, 6 years later, nothing has actually changed. You know, the culture hasn't actually changed. Nothing has changed. Not even, I can't even just, you know, boil it down to just culture, but nothing has actually changed. So you ask yourself, what was the point? What was the value of that OD intervention, or those OD interventions, or whatever it might be? It's actually quite, it's deeply annoying, and deeply offensive. I stayed away from diversity training work for many years for that reason, for very many years. And I kept on telling myself that I am not interested. I do not want to get involved. I saw it popping up all over South Africa over maybe about a 10-year or longer period, all over the place. Diversity training, let's do it. And I personally decided, I'm sorry, I am not interested. I refuse to get involved. But deeply I was bothered, and deeply I knew that I couldn't just, you know, stand aside, because then the same question would apply to me. What's your point? What value are you adding? You know, you're just throwing your toys out of the cot and criticizing from a distance, but you're doing nothing. Thank you very much, Sharon. That is so, you know, useless. So I thought to myself, okay, I need to find a way to step into this space, but in a very different way. And I'm still putting that together. I did manage. Thank goodness. I waited patiently for years, patiently for myself to be ready and to know what it is that I was talking about and what I was on about. And then found a way eventually to step into that space, but still battling to almost like push back the tsunami wave that is still very current and still very strong, and working on how can I, as a practitioner, be of value, where the value is tangible, visible, sustainable, fundamental, you know?
I want to address what Sharon is saying, because it's extremely important, and it goes back to Christo's question about what OD is. We are midwives. We are midwives, okay? When the child is conceived, we're not in the bedroom. We're midwives. OD is midwifing. And the changes that we're talking about take centuries. They take decades. And someone's radio is on here, and all I can hear in my earphones is someone's radio. So if someone's radio is on, I'd appreciate them turning off, because I hear a squealing of a radio. The frustration comes from, I think, the expectation that we deliver change. We don't deliver change. We're in the birth room, not the, what's it called, the in the room where the people are. These are words I don't have in any language. In the delivery room, that's the word, in the delivery room. But we're a midwife, and some of the changes take a long time. And when you think nothing has changed, or when I think nothing has changed, that's a perspective of now. But let's talk about what's going to be seen 100 years from now, okay? But what Sharon raises, or what you raise, is a critical issue, because we sell things, and we have to bring value, and we have to say, this is what we deliver. These are the deliverables, and you know, in a delivery room, we give birth to kids, but we work very hard. We're a dot in history. We're a spot in history, and whether someone in our profession is successful or not is probably not measurable for a long time. A long time. Now, an interesting point for Sharon to consider is that when you rank leaders of a country, and you do. I did recently study this in I'm 71 years old, so I study in adult education, all these things. To rank their prime ministers or to rank their kings or whatever, it changes every generation, because you go and you look back and you say, well, he was unpopular then, but look what he did now. Like if you look at Kennedy, Kennedy was a racist. Now you can see that he was a racist. He did almost nothing. On the other hand, Truman, who was hated, he integrated a lot of institutions in the States, forced integration. And every generation you see it differently. So I can't say that there's no change in what you're doing, but certainly we don't deliver change like hotcakes, and we're little players, kleine Menschen, yeah, little minor players, and what we deliver are teeny drops, but that's not marketable. So I think that what you're doing, without knowing your work, but I imagine is very important, but it's not measurable, it's not tangible, we don't cook hot cakes, and it's very difficult to sell, especially if you're not checking boxes off. So if you're checking boxes off, like here we have that shit everywhere. How many do you allow these languages to be spoken in the dining room? Yes. How many people, engineers, have been educated in the Arabic language? Yes, you check all these things off. That's how we show deliverables, but that's not the change. That's not the change.
That's interesting. I think one of the things that also struck me because it speaks to the humility with which we do the work, and need to do the work because we small players and we just doing something little. It almost leads me into the question of race and racism and organization development. One of the comments you make is that we now want to save the world, but we forget that our work is actually to work on organizations. That's the one piece, and then the other piece is around that what we do in organizations is often deleterious as far as race is concerned.
Is what? What's the word? Is?
It's damaging. What we do is
yeah.
As organization development practitioners.
Yeah, well, look, I don't consider myself an expert on racism. I've read about it, I've studied it, but that's not my forte. My forte is organization development. And organization development practitioners are very biased people, and they're very unaware of their own biases. And so I say, healer, heal thyself. If you don't know what your bias is, if you're shoving down authenticity, if you're shoving down teamwork, if you're shoving empowerment, if you're shoving transparency down people's throats, and you're not aware of your own biases, okay, then in my mind, you are incapable of dealing with racism. And I'll tell you why. Only one reason why I would say that. The liberal racist, someone who denies their racism, is high-handed. They say, oh, and this goes back to Sharon's point. Let's get a couple of things we can measure, and we can say we're not racist anymore. And then everyone smiles at each other, and blah blah blah, and all that phony baloney which comes up. Okay, and why do we drive that? We drive that because that's how we are in our promulgation of Western values. Okay, everything, I understand you come from a culture where your boss can't be criticized. That's fine. Okay, now criticize your boss. I'll give you an example. I work with people. I, for many years, was a psychologist with a group, an army psychologist with a Bedouin unit. The Arabs and the Bedouins serve in the army. Of course, it's not on CNN, but there's a lot of minorities. And I had a group, and I asked a question, and I didn't ask who was the oldest person in the group. I started by pointing my finger at someone and saying, "What is your answer to that?" And I screwed myself because I didn't ask the oldest person. Okay, I asked to hear the opinion of someone who was younger. The boss didn't agree, but he couldn't say it because he didn't want anyone to lose face, and I totally screwed it up. So how am I equipped to deal with racism? What I'm saying is we need to take a long look in the mirror, okay, and ask ourselves, what competence do we have to deal with racism except our own dirty hands?
Any thoughts, comments from anyone on the call?
Just one more from me. I think in answer to the question, excuse me, what competence do I need for me to play that role of OD practitioner facilitator? And I want to take it back to a point that Christo made. And the competence that came to mind immediately was humility.
Absolutely.
Humility.
As long as the humility is, okay, now let's do it my way. If that doesn't come in, that's fine. As long, now in my satiric blog, the head of diversity is called Hugh White, H-U-G-H, new word W-H-I-T. Of course, many people don't understand that Hugh is actually H-U-E, color, Hugh White, but I give him the name Hugh White. And he happens to be both white and straight. And he does diversity 3 ways. There's Diversity Friday, there's Hot Smelly Food Day, and there's also tribal meetings. It's a total satire. It makes a total farce of it because it's all, okay, let's do these activities and then go back to work. But if your humility is driven by, okay, well, if this is the way you see it, okay, this is the way you see it, now let me, as I continue, not be driven by my values. I was in an interesting conversation as a participant in which they were talking about diversity. This was in the States, and one guy said, look, I don't feel personal responsibility for what my ancestors did. You know, as a group, you take the taxes I pay, that's fine. But don't ask me to dump on myself now. I'm not willing to do it. They didn't accept that. And the facilitator worked on this guy's racism. Well, he wasn't racist. He had a different opinion. He said, I take my tax money and pay reparations. Do whatever you want. But I personally don't feel guilty. And the facilitator was hard on him because he was taking a side. And I think that the humility that Christo and Sharon are talking about is the humility not to take sides with our own values. Our expertise is value free. Our expertise is value, and it's very, very difficult. Like I live in probably the only place in the world where there's a war that's been going on for 100 years. And I've facilitated dialogues. The dialogues have ended with my conclusion that the more people dialogue on certain issues, the more they end up hating each other. Because not everything has to be said. That's another thing. You don't have to say everything. Let me ask, there are people here who are married probably or have, do you say everything to your partner? All at once? Yeah. Here, sit down. I'm going to give you some feedback. I'm going to be transparent. Here's what I think of you. I'm going to say everything. Who does that? You got to be crazy to do that. But in OD, that's what we promote. So if our humility includes, Sharon, I'm addressing your comment. If our humility includes okay, maybe let's leave that at the level of what people think and not what they say. That's part of it. Or let's not take sides. Or let's agree that we see this thing very, very differently and not even move on, but let's live with the, they call it in Canada, the turd on the table. Let's leave the turd on the table and learn to live with it. That's a long answer, but I told Christo I shoot off all sorts of directions.
I see I've muted myself. Thank you for sharing off, Allon. That's very interesting. I think what comes up is this this difficult thing of value neutrality almost as a core value of organization development practice. Which,
I'm going to give another example. I was in Beijing, and I speak some Mandarin. Okay, I studied Mandarin for 10 years. It's horrendous, but I can get the gist of what people are saying. And the guy who introduced me said, I want to, he said this in Chinese, I'm going to introduce Allon. We're going to do this in English. He's from Israel. He's Jewish. The Jews are very, very cunning businessmen. Okay, so I want you to listen very closely to what he says, because, and he said it again, if you're talking about cunning business people, you've got to learn from the Jews. I had no problem with that. I didn't see that as biased. I would see that if anyone did that in Canada or in the US or in Europe, I would choke them. I didn't have a problem with that. I didn't have a problem with that. There's a difference between anti-Semitism for people who haven't been exposed to Jews and anti-Semitism for people who have. And by the way, what he said was pure admiration in his terms. But so many of the judgments we make are tainted. Doesn't matter if you're South Africa or in France or in Switzerland, by what American and British theorists have written. Okay, so anyway, that was just an aside. Sorry.
Allon, I want to ask, as we look at this conundrum of the values, or at least this call for us to examine our values, and all of that happens, and then the crisis hits, and there's already this thing, much of what we're doing is bullshit. We're ticking the boxes and we're selling, and we got to sell things, and we're out there because we actually really want to help. I mean, that's fundamentally, I think, why we go into a strange profession like organization development is at some level we really want to help. What's up for us in the crisis? Where are we as a, from your perspective, as a profession? Where are we in the pandemic? Where does
we're in deep shit. We're in deep shit because what's happening in organizations is the following. Number one, they got to do choppy. It's execution time. People are going to be fired en masse. Okay, they're going to be fired en masse. There's going to be massive downsizing, and the massive downsizing, I'm not talking about 10 or 15%. I'm talking about 40%, 50% of people who are going to be just, you know, we got to get, we were 10 engineers, we're going to be 3 engineers. Okay, we had 18 people who were in maintenance, we're going to have 10. Now, that's one. Number two, people don't have money, but governments have money. Why do they have money? Because they print the money. So you're going to need a lot of government contracts. And we have government contracts. That means a lot of rules and regulations and tenders. And you're looking for different people. You're not looking for, I'm going to get up and sell and do this. You talk about the people who, what would be the word? You know, people who came, who have good relationships from university, from what they call in China, Yo Pan Yao, which is the people you grew up in the village who came up to a position of importance. You need, it's not what you know, it's who you know to work with government, or it's what they call in the West corruption, which I think is just a different system, correct? But I don't have to, you know, we're in a very corrupt country, and I know that South Africa is also doesn't run by Swiss standards either. So a lot of work is going to be done by what some people call corruption, which I don't necessarily think is corruption. I think it's another system driven by different values. You're going to have a lot of companies which are going to have to merge together. And it's going to be ugly because people are going to be fighting for their lives. And so I think it's going to be a bloodbath, not necessarily a horrendous bloodbath, but it's going to be a bloodbath. And here we come with all of our humanistic values, which are totally irrelevant. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is how can we bring value? And I think you're going to bring value on 3 specific points. Number 1, the structure of power within organizations is going to change. The people who had power won't have power. The people who had power were people who grew the market, and now the people who are going to have power are people who can save money. So there's a power shift. That's number 1. Second thing is people who had power. So what is power? Number 2 is how can we integrate and save so that we get more for less? And that's not across the board. That's really rethinking your organizational process to understand, do we, I'll take an example from product development. In product development, in companies that I've worked for in Silicon Valley, they say, okay, we need to get this product out in 6 months. Okay, so now let's talk about how we do it, but it's 6 months. That's our driving constraint, 6 months. Okay, now let's talk about it. So here I would say we need to save the client a lot of money. What do we need to do? Okay, that's the driving force, is to maintain relevance. And if we want to maintain all our old values, we're going to be out on our ass. The third thing is we work a lot with internal OD people. They're our friends, they give us clients. They're going to be out on their bum faster than internal OD isn't going to survive this. They're going to be chopped. Choppy is going to come. But companies don't have money to pay that anymore. So we have to find the relevant person to speak to in order to become relevant. And I think the final point that I would make is, you know, how do we market? How do we market this? And I think that if we talk about things like the new normal, or stuff like that, it becomes sloganistic. Now, the truth is, we don't know. I don't know. Maybe some of you know, but I guess very few people know what's going to happen. And that is a marketing strength in my mind. We don't have to say, this is what we deliver. We have to say, I don't know what we deliver. I'm ideal in turbulence. By the way, I don't have takeaways. I don't have a little box which I mark off all the time. I know how to learn. I know how to think. That's my value. And I can bring my added value as someone who is smart to think with you how, for heaven's sake, we can get out of this shit. This is real. It's because if we bring, you know, our old cakes or our old slogans, if they were irrelevant before this crash, they're total nonsense now. So to sum up, we have to help companies work with governance. We have to more for less. We have to drive mergers, and we have to position our selling points very differently, and not work with internal OD because they're dead. How do you say in Afrikaans? Tot?
Do it.
Do it. Okay.
Do it.
Do it. Okay.
Do it. Yeah. Harder D than in German.
Okay.
T. Afrikaans is de.
I know, but I remember that there was a South African practitioner called Lau de Toit, D-T-O-I-T.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always thought that he was like, the name meant that he was like death. but maybe so I got it wrong. So
yeah, and that's a French name. So yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting pointers for us, an interesting shift. You mentioned working with government, and I think that's one of the big areas that's certainly emerging for us and for our clients. What I'm curious about, and that was the initial reason for connecting with you and inviting you on, you mentioned mergers and the coming flood of mergers. In one of your blogs, you mentioned both internal and external mergers. So internal mergers, the merger of departments, functions, etc., etc. And of course, I guess in this kind of market, lots of companies are going to be built up. In your experience, what happens in mergers, and how can we better help in mergers?
okay, I'll give you an example of a client who contacted me 2 days ago. I don't think anything is going to come out of it because they don't have a pot to piss in, but they want to take their customer service and sales and put it in one group. What do they? In other words, they don't want to spend a lot on they don't want to spend a lot on customer service. They just want to just good enough so that people don't. So what is the view? The view is putting a lion, okay, and a man in a ring, and we know how that's going to end. Of course, unless we're in Spain, it's a bullfight or something like that. We know how what's going to happen to the bull. Okay, so what I'm saying is that there is a Darwinistic, approach in which one culture overtakes the other. Okay, you can try and say, well, let's take the best of both cultures, which is absolutely ridiculous because it can't be done. That's not how you change culture. No such thing as taking the best out of both cultures. Even if it was possible, which it isn't, I don't know how you would do that. But a lot of people say, oh, we're merging this and that, and let's take the best of both. Who takes the best? What's the best? How do you do it? Who are the strong people? That's another issue. So there's a Darwinistic approach, and that is the strong will eventually, their culture will be dominant. Now you can say, let's help this be less cruel. And then I would say, well, okay. In other words, it's best to have a non-cruel conflict that takes 5 years, as opposed to saying, this has been an acquisition, and these are the law of the land, and behave according. In other words, shorten the suffering. We have to think about that, because we may want a long process, but if it's inevitable, let's just read the law of the land. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a company. One company traveled business class, and the other traveled economy class. Okay? Each company had about 400 flights a week. Just listen to that, 400 flights a week. The people were always in the air. And all of a sudden, we have one group flying business and one group flying coach. And sometimes they were going to the same client after the merger. So one would get off the plane in Australia and he would feel great. The other would feel like he's been in a hearse, right? He couldn't move. And so what do? So they said, well, let's do the first 2 trips are coach, and then the next trip is business, or up to 100 miles. And they fooled around, and there was more bitterness and more bitterness and more bitterness. And they were trying to do this, we need time. And in the end, the statement came out, everyone is in economy class. That's it. Now, that was very, very unpopular. And they did it after 3 years. What I'm saying is, why not do it after 2 months? Why prolong the suffering? Why? So there's a Darwinistic, you have to take a Darwinistic approach. And I'm not saying, what I'm saying is if I am correct and there is Darwinism, our intervention is as a midwife. We're not going to change that. You don't wake up in the morning and see ants eating elephants. No, you see elephants stomping on ants. Now, you may want to, set up a nature reserve. That's fine. But elephants trample ants. Now, when you have a merger, we have an acquisition, one company is being sold probably because they have a huge problem, or because the person acquiring them has a huge problem. It's a marriage because of some unwanted pregnancy, or someone thinks that there's a lot more in it than there actually is. Or there's often two very unsuccessful companies which are trying to, have some joint bank account or something. Sometimes there's a lot of value, but every time the acquiring company is stronger, always. And the merger and acquisition it needs to respect the laws of nature. That would be number one. And number two is, let's set our expectations properly. If it looks good after 5 years, there's bitterness. That's if it looks good. There's bitterness. What we lost, let's go back to 1945 in Britain. We're reading history now, and we're saying, well, Churchill was this, and the Brits were. Britain was busted. They didn't have a pot to piss in 1945. Churchill was voted out quickly. It was horrendous. Then it was horrendous. Now look how quickly they recovered. But if you live in 1945, it's pretty ugly. And a merger is Britain 1945. Maybe you've got some money in the bank, but you've been you're busted. And let's set our expectations properly. I always come to my clients and say, if it goes bad, everyone's going to lose. And if it goes good, we're going to have a lot of bitterness. Now, do you want to work with me or not? And often people say, with Allon Shevat, he says it in your face, I don't want to go through that. I want to plaster it over. But other people, I have a 3-month merger plan. Everyone will be, singing Dixie after 3 months. Well, it sells well, but to get back to Sharon's point, you can check off the box, but no one's singing Dixie after 3 months. Okay? So I'm saying is, you got to be real. You're a referee in a heavyweight boxing match. Okay? That's what you're doing. You got to make sure, if anyone asks me, what is merger and acquisition? You're in a boxing match. You're the referee. And your job is to step in if someone's going to get killed, and make sure that they obey the rules, and there's a framework that has to happen. But in the end, one guy wins and the other guy loses. And so many OD people say, well, it's a merger of equals and we're going to do this. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So get real, for heaven's sakes.
I think that's a challenging perspective for many of us. Any comments? Any thoughts? Liesel, Roy?
I'm laughing so hard inside of me because this is exactly what you hear.
Yeah.
3-month plan. We are equal. We want some of your culture. You get some of our. That's. And I don't think. Well, I know in lots of circumstances, not with any evil intent. The acquirer actually does really want it to work like that, but it does not.
It's maliciousness in many cases. Like, we want. Not every colonizer was Leopold. Not everyone chopped people's arms off. Okay? Very often the British will say, we're going to build you roads. We're going to build you roads, going to make schools. We're going to convert you. Okay? The attention wasn't, in their eyes, malicious at the beginning, or with some people. But we go into mergers and acquisitions knowing that it doesn't work. I'm not saying that the intentions aren't there. We know it doesn't work the way it's planned. And so what we do, sorry for being so rude, is we take all this Vaseline and we apply it and say, now it's not going to hurt. But that's nonsense, because it's very, very, very difficult. it's difficult to have a boss in another country. You got to work at 8:30 at night or 10 o'clock at night. Half the time you don't understand what the other people are saying. The simplest things take 90 emails or 100 emails. You got to get purchasing, which is located in Luxembourg, to approve every thumbtack you buy. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. And I'm reminded of William Butler Yeats's poem, "This is no country for old men." A merger is a heavyweight boxing match. That's what it is. And we got to make sure that no one gets killed and that people obey the rules.
I think what we've been saying is that that actually sometimes the acquirer is predatory, as if it's a bad thing, and as if we wish that it was not so. But actually, you are saying that that's how it is.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things we can see here in Israel is a lot of the Israeli liberals are saying, well, we need to have all these diversity quotas for Arab Israelis, but the 20 and 30-year-old Arabs who are joining organizations now, and they're educated, they say, look, don't talk about quotas. We want to make a lot of money and have a lot of influence. Give us good jobs. Just stop with this talk about diversity. Give me a car. Give me money. Let me pursue my. Don't forget about labeling. Just set me free. Okay, you don't need to apologize. Just I want money. You know that old song by the Flying Lizards? Money. That's what I want. Just give me money. And so if you go to companies which have been acquired, people say, just tell it to me like it is. Am I subservient to you now? Just say it. I want to know the rules. What's the Americans say in New York? What's going on? I want to know the rules. Don't fool me with your nonsense that you're screwing me and I need to be happy. You know, I have my dentist is South African. He's by the way, some of the accents here that I'm hearing reminds me of how my dentist works with me. And he had to pull 2 teeth, and I said to him, his name is Hilton. I said, Hilton, you know, is this going to hurt? He says, it's not going to hurt me. It's going to hurt you. So, but I go to him for that reason, because he says, yeah, it's going to hurt. I'm not here to comb your hair. I'm here to pull your tooth. And that's what we need to do.
Can I make a comment? I have no experience whatsoever.
Who's this? I can't see who's talking.
It's Sharon.
Go ahead.
Sharon.
Okay.
Yeah. I have no experience whatsoever in mergers and acquisitions, so I can't talk about that. Well, I have some experience, but not extensive. But some thoughts came to mind as you were sharing the dynamics at play in mergers and acquisitions, and I want to make 2 points, and there's a question in it as well. I always say that in South Africa we don't actually have one South Africa. So every time, like you've just said yourself, you know, a South African. Every time I hear somebody saying a South African, it's actually the question that immediately pops into my mind is which one? Because there are so many of us. South Africa is not, you know, unlike maybe you can say the American culture or even the Nigerian culture on the continent. In South Africa, we are so multicultural that it's difficult to say a South African and mean, you know, something cohesive. So that's the one piece that I just want to throw into the mix to say, and when we're talking culture, even organizational culture in South Africa, you find these multiple cultures coming into an organization, and then we want to talk about an organizational culture, which I think makes it that much more challenging. And in that mix, I want to just hone in on the African culture. The question I'm asking myself, and I've been asking for a couple of years, is, you know, just even looking at OD and all of the models and everything else that's in it, and your point about all of it being Western, and imposing the Western philosophies almost, you know, onto our organizations and so on. When you come into this space here, how, and I'm asking you as a practitioner with all of the decades of experience that you have, how does the African culture come in, and what have you seen and learned and experienced, and what questions do you have, what you know, knowledge can you share, or maybe point us in that direction to say this is how, from an OD perspective, we can recognize the African culture and bring it in, or use it, or respect it, you know. I love the examples that you shared about issues around authority, issues around values, issues around conflict resolution, for example, you know, and how they would feature in some of the cultures that you made reference to. The African culture in our organizational space has been struggling for decades to feature, to be seen, to be known, to be learned, even from a knowledge development point of view. It just hasn't happened for at least the 20 odd years that I've been in this space and trying to be the little tiny valuable ant that can do something meaningful. It's just not there. You know, change in African terms, teamwork in African terms, or whatever. It's just not there, and it's been struggling, and it's still struggling. We are Western, and everything Western in our everything, our approach. It's just not there. And I yeah.
Okay, so I want to respond to that as well as I can, which is probably not good enough. But I think that I would look at three places and look at how other people deal with this first. In other words, let's look at Singapore. Okay, Singapore is Chinese, it's Indian, it's Malay. It's extraordinarily diverse, and it's a world power. So what are they doing? Okay, well, because they're certainly doing things that other people aren't doing. And one of the things that I think that you do in Singapore, you can do in Singapore, is what you do is your Singaporean or your Singaporeanness expresses itself in certain places, and your Indianness or your Malayness or your Chineseness expresses itself somewhere else. And they have manifestations of where things come together. For example, in Singlish, which is interesting. I suggest everyone should Google Singlish, which is Singaporean English, which is a vernacular, which words taken from each language, but your identity is we are very, very different. So what we try to do is find some common ground in our organizations and define it together. In the outside world, we allow our other identity to come and express itself. Now that may or may not be relevant for South Africa, but because there's no dominant culture in South Africa, when there is a dominant culture in Singapore, which are Chinese. They're not overly dominant, but they're dominant. Let's look at Hong Kong. Okay, Hong Kong is Chinese and it's English, and they manage somehow to do that. So what are they doing? Okay, and what they're acknowledging, we're both, and it's contradictory, and we live with the contradiction. Okay, so do the Singaporeans. They live with the contradiction. Let's take Israel as an example, where you've got most people here, grandparents didn't come from here, and absolutely everyone it comes from a different place. If I look at my own family, my daughter is married to a Syrian, and my son is married to an Argentinian. Okay, my late wife was from Eastern Europe, and that is a huge amount of diversity, and that's what we live with. Is we're very different. We're very, very different in religion. We're very different in our religious outlook, in the way we deal with things, and you can assume we're all different. Okay, now what can we do together properly? Because we're and I think so. To answer your question, I think that struggle which you're talking about, that's a very positive thing. I don't think we're not getting anywhere. I think it's a long time to do it, because I look at South Africa as a miracle, because I'm 70 years old and I remember what was going on when I was a student. And you may say, well, it's not going anywhere. And by the way, you got skin in the game. I don't, but I look at South Africa with huge amount of admiration from a historical point of view. And I told Christo when we started, I read a lot about South Africa and South African literature, and my sister lives in South Africa. She's married to someone in Hout Bay. So I think that, and then of course you were talking about Africanness. Okay, now I'm not an expert on Africanness, but I certainly know from the things that I've read, and I've read a lot of people don't agree what that is. In terms of, is there a core there, or is that in itself a place of vast diversity, which is put under a umbrella which is hard to operationalize? That takes generations to figure out. But I said, let's live with it, and it's you have to live with it, and you have to accept it, and you have to see a weakness, if possible, as a strength. So part of it is we have a lot of capabilities which others don't. In other words, we know how to live with a huge amount of lack of agreement. That's what we know how to. That's a huge value. We don't even feign agreement. I know the people inside, they don't even feign disagreement. They may be nice and personal, but it's Americans feign agreement all the time. I don't think there's a lot of agreement in America. There's a lot of false agreement. Black Lives Matter. That's a slogan. It'll in a month it'll be dead. Okay, but they feign agreement. They agree enough to have all of these campaigns. But the only thing I would say is, look, it is what it is, and you have to. Part of it is branding. You can brand something, or you can. What I'm saying, I don't know enough about it, is that's what it is, and let's facilitate the change and not let's define the change. Because the change is not, we are midwives. That would be my answer to you. We're midwives. Sharon Shakung is not going to drive that change. You're going to be in the operating room when that baby pops out. And you'll be very, very frustrated, because that's a 50-year pregnancy. Or how would you say pregnancy? Isn't that a proper South African way of saying it? Pregnancy.
You see that's it. We've got hey Allon, we've got pregnancy, and pregnancy. From the Africans, you will get pregnancy. You see. But thank you. I like that. Facilitate the change, do not define it. Thank you.
It's interesting for me, Allon. I think you keep returning us to certainly the way that we have encountered, that I have encountered organization development since I sort of ended up in it, is that we are not the change makers. We are not the change definers. Our founder, the founder of World's View Academy, Craig Yateman, used to say, "You're not King Arthur, you are the wizard." And I think sometimes, especially when we're going through these huge, tumultuous social moments, we get a bit jealous and we want to be part of the act. Yeah, we want to be the change and make the change, and we want to define the change, and that leads to some kind of values zealousness or arrogance. So
That's true.
for me, that's
and frustration.
That's so true. Values, arrogance.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask other people on the call questions, comments from inside organizations, from on the edge of organizations, working outside organizations, working in social change, maybe. Anything for Allon?
Hi, Christo.
Didi, yay.
Hi, how is everybody?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. This is such an interesting conversation. I actually have a few reflections. So I'm in higher education at the moment, and everybody who lives in South Africa understands the history of higher education, especially when it comes to the mergers in higher education. The aftermath of that is still very visible. That's basically why my position exists actually at this university, is to look at the aftermath of a merger. And I think it's work that has kept a lot of OD practitioners in business for a very long time. One of the things I always have anxiety about is concluding the change, making sure that what happened in the merger, we can measure it now, you know, go back to say, is this what we envisioned? And I think this conversation has actually helped me in terms of the anxiety I have about that, because the context has changed. The institution I work for, the merger happened more than 10 years ago. So there have been pockets of different leaders who wanted to see the merger go a different way. The previous Vice Chancellor, Dr. Makgoba, was huge on diversity, so he had a very hard stance on diversity and drove that kind of change. And I think I'm less anxious now, knowing that it doesn't have to be concluded and measured, because we like to measure the kind of initiatives that we're doing. The context has changed. We can look at other options to drive the change and to drive the results that we're trying to do. Yeah, that's the kind of reflection that I was actually going through while we were having this conversation. Very interesting conversation.
Thank you. And I would say one more thing, and that is one of the contexts that I would propose is living with chronic pain. When you have a merger, you have chronic pain. Now, I'm 71 years old. I'm in good shape. I walk 9 kilometers a day or swim, and my back aches. And my doctor always says to me, "That's wonderful. That's the only thing you have is lower back pain. That's very good. Well done." After 10 years after a merger, there should be a lot of pain. It shouldn't be crippling, but you've had a back operation. You know, your back hurts, and that's it. And so it's all about setting expectations. And as far as change, change doesn't have a. This is where Lewin was wrong. You don't unfreeze, change, and refreeze, because it doesn't look like that anymore.
It doesn't.
So thank you. Go ahead.
I'd just like to comment a little bit more on also, HR finds itself in a position where, you know, the other executives are basically like, well, you guys do this stuff, so we want it to be solid, you know? Yeah. We want to know that it's going to turn out the way we wanted it to be. And HR executives are unable to say, no, it's not going to happen that way. It might change.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've encountered that a long time. It's like going. I would say I use a lot of metaphors a lot. But so don't come to a doctor and say, bring my blood pressure down. Okay, no, you have to bring your blood pressure down. I can't bring your blood pressure down. So, but we have to be in a position where we're pointing out barriers to change. Okay, and you do that by setting expectations. It's very, very important to set expectations. These are the things you can do, and then it won't be horrible. It won't be good, but it won't be horrible. And you're coming to me because you want a solution. There's no solution. I can't provide you with a solution. I can make this very, very painful thing a little more comfortable. I'm basically, I'll help rehabilitate. Not, I'll help you rehabilitate, but there's certain cruel things you need to do. So the most important thing that I would say is make critical decisions early. You're going to drag them out, you're going to suffer. So this is like expertise that in terms of, if you want me to help you, I'm not going to say no, but I say, okay, here's your critical decisions. Make them early, because the more you drag them out, as a physiotherapist, I'm going to have a big problem on my hand.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Allon. And Didi, thank you. Other questions from anyone? See, Davida, are you still here? Davida, questions from you? Comments after all that Allon has said?
Question?
So it's Gail here without the camera, but I am waving. If you can all see, I am waving. Allon, I think I'm not in 1 second attempting to speak on behalf of others, but I'm kind of feeling that the quietness is an acknowledgement of the awesomeness of the space that I and possibly a number of others are sitting in at the moment. It's not overwhelm, it's acknowledgement and intrigue and connection with so much of what you've said. So please don't see the 10 million lack of pop-up questions anything other than a deep introspection and acknowledgement and gratitude sitting in my space and possibly in others. I think you've shone a light bravely in a lot of corners where people have feared to tread. I absolutely am in awe with the insight and the diversity opinion that is coming from Sharon, and certainly right now the commentary on the university merger, which keeps leading me to the point of we've got to be having different conversations, and we've got to be brave. Now, I know that's kind of like the worst thing you can ever say, because this militaristic notion of sending bodies in to become cattle fodder, and that's absolutely not what we want. It's got to be a bravery built on a different platform that, as you said earlier, we're not even sure what that platform is going to look like. You know, this VUCA economy and the new normal is actually leading me to large amounts of bile developing within me and even further levels of uncertainty. So I know what I don't like, I know what I don't feel comfortable with, I know what I'm bored by. I love your analogy around we living in slogans. We walk into a business, present a slogan, and then put all our energy and creativity to create that until ... the next best thing. So going back to the input from Sharon, which certainly lifted blinkers from my eyes. Now, as a betogen, Afrikaans word for a resistor, we stood against the apartheid struggle. White South African female in my aged years, I am very keen to engage in the right conversations to move our organizations out of stuckness. But I don't feel now in the least qualified to be able to even engage at that level. So where I have a high level of excitement is where you have put so much stuff into my mind. I love being a thinking partner, and I love hearing what you've said, and now thinking that it is very, very critical that we engage the Sharons of the career and the organizational knowledge that we have sitting there, and find a way of capacitating ourselves and others to stop the bullshit and have the real conversations that we've all been dancing around. We have them in our head, but we just, again, speaking for myself, I know I'm weeing a lot, which is not fair, which is just to be brave enough to have them and not feel incapacitated to do so when we really don't know a whole lot of stuff. So just to acknowledge the awesomeness of the presentation.
Thank you very much.
And certainly for driving a whole new direction of thinking.
Thank you very much, Gail.
Thank you, Gail. I am. Thank you, Gail. I certainly also have that sense of I have got some re-examining to do of some basic premises. Ingrid, I saw your hand going up.
Hi, yeah, I love this. You know, from our conversations before, it's like cut the bullshit. Let's not pretend we're going to be all authentic and sweet. So it resonates very strongly with that. Like, you know, in those workshops, not saying that there's such a thing as safety, actively saying there's no such thing. That's not what we're doing. So I really like that. Thanks, Allon. It's very refreshing, that not that usual leadership bullshit that we get. But the question that I have is actually for Sharon. Sharon, are you still here?
Yep. Sharon unfortunately had to drop.
No.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the kind of question of African culture within white-dominated organizations, because I've seen a couple of people doing things to try and promote African cultural things like Ubuntu and things like that, and it can be incredibly patronizing and embarrassing and essentializing. So maybe, Allon, you've got something from one of your contexts, because I'm not going to presume to have an opinion.
Yeah, the faster an organization moves, the more Western it has to be. Okay, so if we have, let's take major characteristics of cultures which aren't Western. For example, very hierarchical, not transparent, face-saving, work a lot on respect, a lot of Oriental, for example, or characteristics like this. If an organization moves fast, very fast, you have to be open, you have to be fast, and the strategy becomes, the speed becomes your strategy. The slower the organization works, the more that the diversity can be factored in. That's why a lot of the high tech is so American, because they got to move quickly and have to adapt quickly. And they can adapt quickly because of the way that they're structured. They don't have the complexity which bogs you down. So they can move quickly. The more diverse you are, the different ways you react to stress, to the need for immediacy. So I think that you have to ask yourself, where can we do this, and not how can we do it? Because there's certain organizations which, for example, would be more South African or African, where it's probably possible to do it. But when you're talking about a global organization, we're talking about Western dominance. Okay, so if you take an Israeli organization, people will come late, they'll all talk at the same time, they'll reopen decisions, and they'll argue with each other constantly. But when you're in, which is very Israeli culture, when you're in a conversation with the Germans, You have to play by the music that they're playing, because you're a small player. So I think that a lot of the questions that which you're asking about, expressing your Africanness, that's not where you do it, not how you do it, but where you do it. And you'd have to do it where basically it's an organization where you have the time to do it and the space to do it and the tolerance to do it. Okay, you can't be as you'd like to be in a global organization, especially because what Sharon said, you're so diverse among yourselves. So it's product development. You have to work on that very, very slowly and on a small scale, and avoid a lot of symbols and slogans. You have to make it real, authentic, and not
Yeah, I think that kind of answers my question somewhat indirectly, but it makes sense because, what Sharon was alluding to, like the listening faces, and, it's a bit of a sham and everybody knows it. And I've seen a lot of programs in South African organizations, especially diversity programs, where it's just very, very painfully patronizing. And I like the fact that there's a realism about what you're saying. It's like, okay, this is how it works around here. This is what we've got to do. And that's not patronizing at all.
I also think because South Africa, like Israel, is in a very, very, very difficult, the cards we've been dealt to build a society are very, very difficult. The expectations need to be very, very low in terms of what success looks like. Okay, because then you have patience. You have to have patience. You can't do this. You can't do this quickly. You can't do this quickly, and you can't do it well. You can do it slowly with a lot of error, and you have to be kind to yourselves, because let's look at these false faces that people are putting on. That's horrible, but it's better than it used to be. That's for sure. And what you're doing now will look better eventually. It doesn't mean that everything that doesn't need to be corrected, but always look at the alternative. And when you look at the alternative, take the amount of time that you want to do it and multiply it by 1,000, because maybe in 300 or 400 years, we'll have what you want. And you know what? You won't be around to see it. That's the job of an OD person.
Yeah, that's one of the other core principles, isn't it? It's the long line of OD. It is not. It's
parenting. It's parenting in a way. You do this with your kids, and then he goes out and does something else, or she does something else. What can you do? It's not instant. It's not instant. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks. I like that long view. It's very helpful.
Thank you.
And it's very humbling. Especially for those of us who grew up with such structural racism and such overt racism in South Africa.
Thank you, Ingrid. Any other questions?
Hi, Christo, Toto here. I wonder if you can see my hand.
I see it now, Toto.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for arranging this, but also to Allon, thank you so much. One of my take-home messages of the things that Allon said that made me think back of is this thing of OD practitioners being midwives, and that made me think back a good say maybe 18 years ago when I was working in one of the banks in South Africa, and at the time it was pure, if I can put it that way, white dominated institution, and I remember the branch that I worked at. I was actually the first black person to work in that branch. The only black people who were there were two guys who were cleaners and one colored guy who was a messenger. And as years goes by, then the transformation thing started on, and we had to go through what is termed organizational change. And I think that was my first interaction with that in a corporate world, and I got excited. I was part of the team. We went through that all over the country and say change, 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 change. But at the end of the day, most of us, especially young black employees who were sort of leading or being part of the process, and you find Christo, just not you, but just to mention a name, who has been with for over 35 years and who said, I am not going anywhere. I'm not going to listen to this. Who the hell are you with your qualification to come and tell me? Remember, it was that time when transformation was such a taboo to mention. But just to maybe to bring it home, to say this, however the interventions may be, even from CEO or from the board of directors, this thing will have to start within. If you don't, as an individual, say to yourself, I want to be part of the change, I need to know that this is a process. I win some, I gain some, and some I have to share. Like I think it's Ingrid who wanted to talk more about the change and how sometimes it can make people, or I can't remember the word that she patronized, to say, yes, at some point one needs to be allowed to be patronized because the other person cannot see right inside your mind. And at some point, you patronize other people without also being aware that you are patronizing. Hence, I'm saying it's a three-legged animal. You win, you lose, but some you need to share.
Yeah.
Because if you don't share the space, we can work together. If we don't loosen ourselves, but also just in a parting shot to say, Allon, you mentioned if you open yourself up, you may open yourself up to be screwed. It depends
Yeah.
how far you get screwed. Definitely, you have to get screwed. If we don't allow ourselves to get screwed, then definitely there is no movement. This will be a chat room, and another one. So that's basically what I wanted to say, and to say thank you so much as well.
I want to say, Toto, in terms of what you're saying, is some people want to succeed and we're moving slowly because I want to succeed. I want to succeed. But it's not about you. It's not about you. So you want to succeed. Okay, you want to succeed. Take something which is easily measurable. Do a spreadsheet. Clean your toilet or do whatever you want. But I want to succeed. So you want to succeed. I want to be 40 years old again. That's fine. But let's not, if you're doing something very, 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 very complex and you need to see success, you have a problem with your career choice because it's not about you. It's not about you at all.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite words where I work now. When I interact with colleagues and we start not agreeing, and I'll just say, without even thinking, I said, "Oh, Sister Ebru, this is not about you. And the person will just stop right there because it's definitely not about us. No organization or anyone a thing.
Totally. I totally agree. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Toto. Roy?
I was just thinking about a conversation that that I had a while back, and the statement of the conversation was, organizations aren't democracies. You don't need permission to leave an organization. You don't need, you know, so the notion of having all views, celebrating all diversity, celebrating, you know, perhaps the social contract has been misunderstood over time, and misrepresented with the type of work and ad lib initiatives. But perhaps what the social contract in an organization or a merger or acquisition should be is, you're here to add value. These are the rules. And let's have that conversation as quickly as possible.
Yes. And let's talk about the barriers that exist and what we can change and what we can't change. And then let's focus on what we can change without the what's the word? Without the arrogance of solving all these huge issues that greater people than us haven't managed to solve. We are midwives. We're not genetic engineers. We're not cultural demons. We remove barriers to small changes. There's a Hebrew poem which says, happiness the size of a dot on the lizard's tail. That's what we do. That's our business.
And what a beautiful way to end it off. Happiness the size of a dot on a lizard's tail. That's our business. Hello. May I sloganize that, please?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Allon. That was so much for us. Thank you for joining.
Thank all of you. Thank all of you. It was an absolute pleasure, and I love the questions, and I love talking to you. And great. Just thank you so much for the invitation and for the comments. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, Toto.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. That was great.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid.
Stranger.
It's nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
Oh, I've been busy, man. I've been trying to work on my research.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Christo, stop the recording so we don't have to.
Yep. It's recording.
We're struggling with